John Wayne wasn't known for keeping his opinions to himself. In fact, he wore them like a badge of honor. To understand why he couldn't stand Kirk Douglas, you have to start with the one thing Wayne cared about almost as much as making movies: politics. Wayne was a die-hard conservative, fiercely patriotic, and a loud supporter of America's military and the anti-communist movement during Hollywood's most controversial era, the Red Scare. He backed the House Un-American Activities Committee and had no issue with the blacklisting of writers and actors suspected of leftist ties. Wayne wasn't just a bystander. He was the president of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. The name alone tells you where he stood. To him, Hollywood needed to be cleaned of un-American influences, and he took that job seriously. So when an actor like Kirk Douglas came along, someone with charm, swagger, and a brain that leaned politically left, Wayne didn't just see a co-star. He saw an enemy. Douglas, unlike Wayne, didn't pick fights openly, but he also didn't shy away from being on the opposite side of the debate. While he wasn't waving flags at rallies, he was quietly building a reputation as someone who supported civil rights, believed in free expression, and wasn't afraid to question the establishment. And to someone like Wayne, that kind of thinking wasn't just disagreeable, it was dangerous. Their first few meetings weren't explosive, but the tension was always there. They were like oil and water. On the surface, they could smile for the cameras and shake hands, but behind the scenes, they were sizing each other up. Wayne thought Douglas was arrogant, too modern, too willing to break the mold of the traditional American hero Wayne had spent his whole career defining. Douglas, on the other hand, saw Wayne as outdated, stubborn, and clinging to a black and white version of the world that no longer made sense. Hollywood was changing. The 1960s brought in a new wave of filmmaking, and while Wayne tried to stand firm, Douglas was already moving with the tide. But their political differences didn't stay confined to private conversations or offhand comments. They started bleeding into the project they worked on together, creating a kind of quiet war on every set they shared. One of the biggest flashpoints came during a time when most actors avoided public political declarations. Kirk Douglas did the opposite. He spoke out about civil liberties and even took part in breaking the blacklist by crediting Dalton Trumbo for Spartacus, something that enraged many conservatives, including John Wayne. To Wayne, Douglas wasn't just voicing an opinion. He was undermining everything Wayne believed America stood for. It wasn't about ego. It was about ideology. Wayne didn't just dislike Douglas. He saw him as a threat to the values he held sacred. And in Hollywood, where appearances were everything, this ideological feud would only grow louder, more public, and far harder to ignore. Despite the growing tension between them, John Wayne and Kirk Douglas did something that might surprise you. They worked together, multiple times. You'd think that two men with such opposite worldviews would avoid sharing a set like the plague, but Hollywood isn't built on personal comfort. It's built on box office potential. And back then, putting Wayne and Douglas in the same film was a guaranteed ticket seller. Their first major collaboration came in Harm's Way in 1965, a World War II epic that demanded strong screen presence and even stronger egos. Wayne was already an icon by then, with decades of westerns and war films under his belt. Douglas, just a few years younger, had carved his own path as a more nuanced, edgy actor who brought intensity to every role. On set, they managed to keep things professional. No public blow-ups, no walk-offs. But if you looked close enough, the ice was visible. Douglas once said in an interview that he respected Wayne's dedication and his work ethic, but they never saw eye to eye. That wasn't an exaggeration. It was an understatement. Between takes, there wasn't much mingling, no casual laughs, no shared drinks at the end of the day. Just two men doing their jobs and keeping their distance. For the audience, the chemistry worked. But behind the scenes, it was more like control burn. Their next project together, Cast a Giant Shadow, was a little more volatile. Douglas had the lead role, portraying a real-life Jewish-American colonel who helps Israel during its War of Independence. Wayne's role was smaller, but still powerful. Off camera, though, the political divide started to deepen. Douglas was passionate about the story, especially given his Jewish heritage and his desire to bring more meaningful, socially driven narratives to the screen. Wayne? Let's just say he wasn't moved by the same motivations. Still, they made it through. Maybe it was mutual respect, or maybe it was just old-school professionalism. Neither man wanted to be seen as the one who couldn't handle it. And in that sense, they were more alike than they wanted to admit. Both were proud, driven, and fully committed to their craft. They believed in discipline. They didn't flake. Even if they couldn't stand each other, they wouldn't let that ruin a film. But there was one movie where things nearly boiled over: The War Wagon. This is where the silent feud started getting louder. The political climate in America was heating up, and Wayne had started publicly campaigning for Ronald Reagan and taking aim at Hollywood liberals. Douglas, meanwhile, was getting involved with Democratic causes and even shooting a campaign ad on the side. When filming began, the tension wasn't just personal. It was political, public, and impossible to ignore. And yet, they still showed up, still hit their marks, still got the job done. But under the surface, something was cracking. And what happened next would push their fragile working relationship closer to full-blown animosity. By the time The War Wagon rolled into production in 1967, the friction between John Wayne and Kirk Douglas wasn't just a rumor. It was undeniable. On the surface, the movie was a classic Western heist film. Two unlikely partners joined forces to rob a gold shipment in the Wild West. Off-screen, though, the real standoff wasn't between outlaws. It was between two Hollywood legends with a growing hatred simmering just beneath the surface. From day one, the energy on set was off. Kirk Douglas arrived late on the first day of shooting, and not just by a few minutes. He'd been out filming a Democratic campaign ad the night before, showing his support for liberal candidates, a move that instantly rubbed Wayne the wrong way. To someone like Douglas, it was just another gig. But to Wayne, who was campaigning for Ronald Reagan and was deeply tied to conservative values, it felt like a slap in the face. Wayne was furious, not because of the lateness itself, but because it felt intentional. It was as if Douglas was making a statement. I don't need to play by your rules. Wayne didn't take that lightly. He saw professionalism as sacred, and punctuality was part of that code. So when Douglas strolled in with his signature grin, Wayne didn't smile back. He seethed. The tension didn't stay behind closed doors for long. Crew members reported a noticeable chill between the two actors. They barely spoke unless the cameras were rolling. When they did, it was curt, direct, and often delivered with an edge. Douglas, ever the provocateur, didn't back down. He loved challenging authority, and Wayne was a perfect target. There's even a bizarre little story that floated around the set, one that perfectly captures how passive-aggressive things have become. According to some sources, Wayne took a pair of Pablo boots that were custom-made for Douglas and started wearing them himself. If it sounds petty, that's because it was. But it also speaks to the childish brinkmanship happening behind the scenes. These weren't just actors clashing over dialogue. They were locked in a cold war of egos and politics. Still, neither man stormed off set. Neither refused to work. They knew the cameras didn't care about personal drama. But if you look closely at The War Wagon, there's a subtle tension in their scenes together, an unspoken friction in every glance and line delivery. It wasn't acting. It was real, and perhaps the most ironic part of it all, audiences loved it. The film was a box office success, thanks in large part to the on-screen chemistry that their off-screen tension produced. Hollywood has always had a strange relationship with conflict. It tears people apart behind the scenes, but sometimes it makes for unforgettable performances on screen. But The War Wagon wasn't just another movie. It was the turning point. After that, their political and personal differences became impossible to ignore. Wayne had always seen Douglas as the other side, but now he saw him as something worse, a threat to the very idea of America he believed in. And the deeper they went into that ideological battlefield, the harder it became to separate the man from the enemy. John Wayne wasn't just a man with opinions. He was a man with a mission. By the late 1960s and into the early 70s, Wayne had become a symbol of traditional American conservatism. He wasn't hiding behind veiled statements or cautious interviews. He was openly, unapologetically political. And that's where things started to really unravel between him and Kirk Douglas, not just privately, but publicly. Wayne's views weren't mild disagreements over taxes or foreign policy. He held deeply controversial stances that often crossed into troubling territory. In a now infamous 1971 interview with Playboy, Wayne made a string of comments that shocked even some of the supporters. He defended white supremacy in certain situations, dismissed the plight of Native Americans by saying they were selfishly trying to keep this land, and brushed aside the fight for civil rights as petty grievances. The interview made headlines, and not in a good way. To someone like Kirk Douglas, who'd spent years quietly supporting progressive causes and standing up for marginalized voices in Hollywood, this wasn't just offensive, it was personal. Douglas had Jewish roots and had seen firsthand what happens when prejudice goes unchecked. He'd long been disturbed by Wayne's rigid black and white worldview, but now the divide between them wasn't just about politics. It was about morality. And yet, Douglas didn't go on a rant. He didn't call Wayne out by name or start media war. That wasn't his style. Instead, he responded with something even more powerful: his work. Just a few years earlier, Douglas had helped end the Hollywood blacklist by publicly crediting Dalton Trumbo, a blacklisted screenwriter, as a writer of Spartacus. It was a quiet rebellion against everything Wayne supported, and it hit hard. Wayne saw the blacklist as a necessary purge. Douglas saw it as a stain on American freedom. But Wayne didn't stay silent either. He made it clear in interviews and speeches that he thought Hollywood was being overrun by leftist ideas, and he often lumped Douglas into that category, even if he didn't say his name. In Wayne's eyes, actors like Douglas were part of the problem. Too soft, too intellectual, too willing to sympathize with the wrong side of history. Douglas, for his part, continued to rise above it, at least in public. In interviews, he dodged direct shots, preferring to frame Wayne as an old friend with very different values. But the strain was always there, right beneath the surface. Two titans of film who shared the same era, but never the same vision. The irony is, they were both products of the same country, the same industry, and even the same kind of stories. But while Wayne clung to the image of the untouchable American cowboy, Douglas was pushing for something more complex: flawed heroes, deeper meaning, and moral gray areas. And the more Douglas moved in that direction, the more Wayne saw him as a symbol of everything going wrong. Their feud was no longer about lines in a script. It was about the future of Hollywood, and who had the right to define what America stood for. But Douglas wasn't done yet. And the next time he spoke publicly about Wayne, the whole world took notice. By the late 1970s, the silent tension between John Wayne and Kirk Douglas could no longer be contained behind studio gates or polite deflections. What started as a clash of ideologies had now evolved into an unspoken rivalry that was far too public to ignore. And while both men had mastered the art of delivering sharp opinions through controlled interviews, the gloves were finally coming off. It all started when Kirk Douglas appeared on The Dick Cavett Show, a popular talk show known for its intelligent guests and sharp political commentary. Douglas, calm and calculated as always, didn't attack Wayne outright. But when the host mentioned John Wayne's Playboy interview, particularly Wayne's inflammatory comments on race and politics, Douglas didn't flinch. He smiled and said, "Well, I always admired Duke as an actor, but let's just say I didn't share many of his beliefs." The audience laughed, but the subtext was clear. Douglas was distancing himself from Wayne's increasingly controversial reputation. It wasn't just a throwaway line, it was a clear message. In a time when America was already divided over Vietnam, civil rights, and Watergate, every word carried weight. Douglas had just taken a shot, and Wayne knew it. Wayne responded the way he always did, through the press, In a rare moment of public irritation, he told the Los Angeles Times that Kirk always liked to think he was more enlightened than the rest of us. Let him have his opinions. I stand by mine. He didn't mention Douglas by name in most interviews, but the digs were unmistakable. Hollywood's been taken over by pseudo-intellectuals, Wayne said in another appearance, a clear reference to actors like Douglas who were more interested in pushing political narratives than playing cowboys. At that point, the media began framing the feud as something bigger than personal dislike. It had become symbolic. Wayne stood for old school, flag-waving Americana. Douglas represented the new, morally complicated era of Hollywood that questioned everything from foreign wars to institutional racism. The two actors, once merely ideological opponents, had become avatars in the cultural war playing out on TV screens and newspaper headlines across the country. Still, neither man ever resorted to screaming matches or tabloid meltdowns. That wasn't their style. Their feud was cold, classy, and sharp-edged, like two poker players constantly raising the stakes without ever showing their full hands. And that's what made it so fascinating. This wasn't some cheap celebrity spat. It was a slow-burning war of ideas, played out in interviews, subtle jabs, and pointed public appearances. And when Douglas eventually called out Wayne's legacy, not his roles, but his message, things got even tenser. He played great heroes, Douglas said in a later interview, but I never confused him with the characters he played. It was subtle, it was sharp, and it hit deep. Wayne may have never responded directly, but those close to him said that line stayed with him. Because for a man who was his image, any suggestion otherwise was more than criticism. It was betrayal. And the true irony? Their final exchange would come not on a set, not on TV, but in a moment that neither of them saw coming. By the late 1970s, John Wayne's larger-than-life image had started to crack. Not in the public's eyes, but in his own. Age and illness had begun to take their toll. He'd been battling cancer for years. Quietly at first, then more openly as his health declined. But even as his body weakened, his convictions never did. Wayne stayed vocal, proud, and unwavering. He still believed in the same America he had always portrayed on screen. But behind that steel exterior, there was something else. Reflection. For Kirk Douglas, time hadn't softened his ideals either, but it had changed how he viewed the man he once saw as a symbol of everything he opposed. In later interviews, Douglas began to speak differently about Wayne. Not flatteringly, but respectfully. He called Wayne a giant, not just for his box office draw, but for the shadow he cast over the entire industry. We didn't agree, Douglas admitted, but you couldn't ignore him. He was the movies. What many people don't know is that in the final year of Wayne's life, a letter arrived for him, written by none other than Kirk Douglas. The contents were never made public in full, but Douglas later hinted at what he said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a truce. It was a kind of acknowledgement that despite all their differences, they had fought the same war in a way. Two warriors on opposite ends of the battlefield, both trying to protect a version of truth they believed in. Wayne never wrote back. Whether because of pride, illness, or the sheer weight of everything left unsaid, no one can be sure. But friends of Wayne said he read the letter more than once. Quietly, alone. And when he passed away in 1979, it was Douglas who released one of the most thoughtful public statements. John Wayne was a symbol of everything I disagreed with politically, but he was also the kind of man you couldn't help but respect. He believed in what he said, and he lived it. In a strange way, their feud was never really about each other. It was about ideas, about the soul of the country being tugged in two directions. And while they clashed constantly, there was something almost necessary about it. Without Douglas, Wayne's version of America might have gone unchallenged. Without Wayne, Douglas's calls for change might not have carried the same weight. They defined each other, not as friends, not as enemies, but as counterweights in a world that's never black and white. Today, when people look back at their careers, they see more than just classic films or box office numbers. They see a snapshot of American culture at its most divided and most determined. Two icons, Two visions, one unforgettable rivalry. But even in the silence of that final goodbye, one thing was clear. Neither man would have changed a thing. The story of John Wayne and Kirk Douglas isn't just about two movie stars clashing behind the scenes. It's about two towering forces who stood on opposite ends of a cultural and political divide and never once pretended otherwise. Wayne, the immovable icon of American traditionalism, believed in a clear-cut world of heroes and villains. He saw his roles as moral anchors in a changing, chaotic society. Douglas, on the other hand, challenged that simplicity. He believed in nuance, in broken heroes, in uncomfortable truths. And that difference? It drove them apart, not just personally, but ideologically. Yet despite all the tension, all the quiet jabs and icy standoffs, there was a strange kind of mutual respect underneath it all. Because deep down, they both knew they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. Not just stardom, but legacy. And perhaps that's what makes this feud so unforgettable. It wasn't loud. It wasn't petty. It was philosophical. It forced audiences to ask, who defines America? Who gets to tell its story? Wayne and Douglas may have never agreed on the answers, but by pushing against each other, they made sure we never stopped asking questions. If this story surprised you or made you see these Hollywood legends in a new light, hit that like button and subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stories that pull back the curtain on fame, power, and legacy. And remember, sometimes the real drama isn't in the script. It's what happens when the cameras stop rolling.